faith and voting rights webinar to discuss what we consider a critical issue. My name is David Currie. Among other things, I am the chair of the Non-Urban Rural Caucus for the Texas Democratic Party. I am a board member of the Interfaith Alliance with Rabbi Jack Moline, who is our president for at least 25 years. Jack, I guess. I'm on the board of pastors for Texas Children with my 35-year friend, Charles Johnson, who is our executive director there. Mitch Randall is joining us. Mitch is now head of Good Faith Media. He was, prior to that, he was head of the Baptist Center for Ethics. Prior to that, he was a pastor in Oklahoma. Prior to that, I tried to hire him to work with me on numerous occasions. So we're still getting to work together a little bit. I'll give a little bit more of a formal introduction in just a second. I just want to say hi to folks. Skye Perryman is a new board member of the Interfaith Alliance, of which Jack and I are tremendously grateful. Exceptionally bright, Skye. I'm just super proud to make your acquaintance. And Starlette, this is our first time to meet, but I'm thrilled to see you and Rose as well. Thank y'all for being here with us. Quick introductions. Jack Moline is the president of the Interfaith Alliance. He's a native of Chicago. He's a huge Cubs fan. I actually have a 20-word description. I'll read it. President of the Interfaith Alliance. He's also Rabbi Emeritus of the Gundas Hakeem congregation in Alexandria, Virginia. I'm sure I Texanized those words extremely well, where he served in the pulpit for 27 years. He's an adjunct member of the Jewish Theological Seminary and the Virginia Theological Seminary. He serves as co-chair of the Virginia Commission on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, appointed by Governor Terry McAuliffe after the Charlottesville incident. He is the author of 2 books, as I am, and contributes to many publications, both print and web-based. Jack does a weekly mail-out devotional, and 3 weeks ago he did it about me and my grandfather, and I need to send it to all of you. It's one of the most moving things I've ever read, and thank you so much for that, Jack. I mentioned Mitch again real quick. Mitch is Chief Executive Officer of Good Faith Media. Before joining there, he was Executive Director of Baptist Center for Ethics, pastored churches Kansas, Texas, and Oklahoma for over 20 years. Holds a master's with biblical languages from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary and a Doctor of Ministry degree from George W. Truett Seminary and from Baylor University, Sickle Bear. So we're grateful to have him with us. He's married to his wife, Missy, and has 2 children. Skye Perryman, and I got to look up Starlette while I'm doing this right quick. Starlette, give me a break here. Because I got yours after I left my office, so I couldn't print it out. If y'all don't know me very well yet, you know that I don't do formal real well. Skye Perryman is a lawyer and advocate, a leader with a track record of taking on and winning critical fights that advance democratic values, stops abuses of power, and improves the well-being of people and communications. She's recently was named president and CEO of Democracy Forward Foundation in June of 2021, returning to the organization where she was the founding litigation team. Skye, I want you to tell us about that in a minute. Charlie Johnson, oh goodness, Charlie. Charlie was pastor of Second Baptist Church in Lubbock, Trinity Baptist Church, San Antonio, Bread Fellowship at Fort Worth. He's executive director of Pastors for Texas Children. Like I said, he's been my friend for 35 years. He's one of the people that I think preaches better than me, and there aren't many people I say that about, but you do, Charlie. You really do. Starlette Thomas is with us. She is an author, an activist, a visual artist, and a race abolitionist. Reverend Starlette Thomas is a womanist in ministry and the principal architect of a raceless world. Her podcast, The Raceless Gospel, takes her listeners to church and to virtual church service where she and her guests tackle that taboo trinity, race, religion, and politics. Pastor, denominational leader, and clergy coach, she is a natural shepherd of words and people, leading both to their authentic and best expression. Graduate of both Buffalo State College and the Colgate Rochester Crozier Divinity School. Upstate New York is a little ways from Texas, Starlette, but good to have you. And you work with Good Faith Media with Mitch, correct? Yeah, that's great. You're nodding. I appreciate that. Okay, I've covered everybody but Rose. Tell me about Rose.
Hi, David. Thank you so much for asking me to join y'all. I'm the voter protection director with the Texas Democratic Party. Just here to jump in at the end with a way that folks can support the effort, but mostly here to listen and learn and appreciate joining.
Well, we appreciate that. As y'all know, here in Texas, we have quite a voter suppression law going to be voted on probably tomorrow. So I have been in dialogue with my good friend, and I mean that, very good friend, Republican State Representative Drew Darby. Charlie and I, our organization, honored Drew last year because he is a champion of public education. And we're very much a nonpartisan organization that pastors for Texas children. And Drew asked me today to tell him what the problems I actually had with that bill. And Rose helped me some with that. And I'll be communicating that with him later this evening, because this is a very important topic. Democracy depends on people having the right to vote and the ability to vote. And it is a Christian, Jewish, moral, religious issue, in my opinion, first based on the fact of everybody's created in the image of God. I mean, from just the starting point, the image of God. And we happen to have this horribly dysfunctional, wonderful system in America called democracy that allows people to vote. But it only works if people can vote. So one of the things we're doing here in Texas is we had a thing last year because of the pandemic for drive-in voting. Well, I was 67 last year and my wife was 77 that you just met. It was great to be able to vote out of my pickup.
Mm-hmm.
And why can't everybody vote out of their pickup in Texas?
Right.
Not everybody has a pickup, but you ought to have a pickup. So everybody ought to get to, it's just when you try to take away and limit people, like in Houston, they had all night voting. That's wonderful. And one of the things I'll communicate with Drew is, and I disapprove of this with the For the People bill in Washington, D.C. as well. I do not believe one size fits all. I think we should have things that say everybody ought to have a voting drop box in their precinct, but local counties should have the right to expand that to meet their needs. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just the right thing to do. But it all stems back to the worth of the individual created in the image of God that every single faith tradition embraces and believes in. And my speech is over. Rabbi Jack Moline, I've asked to be the first speaker. He has actually been to this piece of dirt that I'm sitting at, looking at Ringo and little Daisy out there. Jack, my last two goats I raised on a bottle. He's actually fed the llamas and had the sheep and the goats charging. I've filmed it. You can see the look on his face with these animals charging at him. But we're not here to talk about that, Jack. Let's keep it. Let's talk about voting rights and your Jewish tradition.
Thank you, David. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for giving the speech that I was just going to give. I try to live my life faithfully. I try to live faithfully to my God and tradition, and I try to live faithfully to our country, and especially the Constitution. I do not believe that any government can define my faith, or that any faith can define my government. But I do sit up and take notice when both my religion and my society see 100% eye to eye. And nowhere is that more true, as David kindly pointed out for y'all, than when it comes to human equality. Scripture, my scripture, your scripture, whatever yours is, posits exactly what the Declaration of Independence and the 14th Amendment to the Constitution insist is correct. All people are created equal. As Americans, we express that equality in the great franchise. One person, one vote. One person gets no more than one vote, but one person gets no less than one vote. And any attempt to diminish the rights of any person or any people or any group of people to exercise the franchise is, in my opinion, offensive to my values, an insult to human equality, and patently a violation of both the letter and the spirit of the law. I will tell you that Interfaith Alliance is not a voting rights organization. It's not our issue to advocate for voting rights or for a particular approach to voting rights. Our motto is protecting faith and freedom. But this question of voter suppression is, to my mind, for me, a matter of faith and freedom. And that's why people of good faith, people who are sympathetic to Interfaith Alliance, people who are members of Interfaith Alliance, people who even think about Interfaith Alliance, have to know that if we're talking about protecting faith and freedom, we're talking about protecting the right to vote and the access to vote. So I'm very glad to be here with you today. That's my whole message. That's what I've got to say. And you're going to hear from some good people who are going to deepen what I've just suggested.
Thank you, Jack. I hope to want to let the format is sort of let each one of these esteemed people say a few words about why they're participating in this and why voting rights is a spiritual issue for them. And then I hope to have some dialogue between the five of them, especially. And you can already tell I've kind of been known to interject myself when I feel like it. So the six of us will have a few things to say. Mitch, you're grinning over there, so let's let you go next, and then I'm going to go Skye, then I'm going to go Charlie, and then I'm going to go Starlette, okay? Mitch, you talk to us about Good Faith Media and why you're participating this evening.
Well, David, first of all, let me just say I am honored to be here with you and this esteemed panel. This is central to our existence as not only citizens of the United States, but as people of faith. And this sacred right, as the late Representative John Lewis alluded to it, he said, voting is a right, but he said it comes close to a sacredness, is vitally important to who we are as a people of faith. And this is under attack today. In many of the research that we have done at Good Faith Media and other organizations that I have led, there is a concerted effort to attack voter rights. And these pieces of legislation that are being passed across the country, such as Texas and Georgia, are really pointed at people of color. And it is an attempt at reestablishing a white patriarchy in this country that we have worked long and hard to separate ourselves on, or in to bring up and fight for equality as a people of faith and strive towards that more perfect union. I remember the words back in 1980 of conservative political activist Paul Weyrich when he said, "I don't want everybody to vote. Elections are not won by a majority of people. They never have been from the beginning of our country, and they are not now. As a matter of fact, our leverage in elections quite candidly goes up as the voting populace goes down." Weyrich's words still echo in our ears today as we see these pieces of legislation being passed across the country. The thing about Weyrich is he wasn't lying. The reality persists that this country, the United States of America, the country that we love and adore, has a history of voter suppression. In fact, the right to vote has never freely been offered to anyone besides white male citizens who had money. For anyone else, that casting a ballot in these previous elections, that right was fought for by individuals demanding that they be heard and represented. So just real quickly, let's think about this historically. In 1788, when the Constitution was adopted, voting rights were left to the states, resulting in mostly white Anglo-Protestant males having the right to vote. Other qualifications included land ownership and being over the age of 21. It wasn't until 1870, when the 15th Amendment was ratified, that Black men were given the right to vote. Of course, we know that some states immediately began to instill poll taxes, literacy taxes, and grandfather clauses suppressing the Black vote. In 1920, after many years of fighting for their right to vote, women were finally given the right when the 19th Amendment was passed. And then 4 years later, in 1954, my ancestors, the indigenous people of North America, were finally allowed to cast ballots. And it wasn't until 1943 that Asian Americans were allowed to the sacred right of voting. And there have been other restrictions lifted over the years, but it wasn't until 1965, as we all know, after that bloody Sunday on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, did the country finally see a sweeping Voting Rights Act outline discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or sex, national origin, and later sexual orientation and gender identity. This is a more perfect union when we strive towards encouraging more and more citizens to be part of the American experience. But that opportunity is under attack. And the idea of creating a more perfect union is under attack. These motivations recently attempted to suppress voter rights come from a group of people terrified that they are losing wealth, power, and influence. And I'm talking none other than white evangelical Christians. They lament the days when they controlled institutions, economies, and social ethics. And they are currently, as they always have, with these latest attempts to suppress voting rights under the false premise of electoral integrity, continue to fight to maintain wealth, power, and control. Again, this is a sacred right. And these latest attempts to strip away voting rights in states like Texas and Georgia are not only unconstitutional, but as a person of faith, I find them abhorrently sinful. As a follower of Jesus, his words and actions were always one of inclusivity and justice. He died in hopes of giving everyone the opportunity to participate in the grace and love and justice of the divine. He didn't want anyone to be left out. What we are seeing across this country with voter suppression legislation, I believe, is a backlash against people of color actively participating in the American experiment. Simply put, powerful, wealthy white folks will not give up their wealth and power without a fight. Therefore, I contend to you tonight that as our ancestors did in 1870, 1920, 1924, 1943, and 1965, we must rise up and do the same in 1921. May we do everything in our power to broaden the sacred right of voting for all citizens so that all voices can be heard, all persons respected, and all votes counted. This is the more perfect union we need to be striving towards.
Mitch, amen. What a history lesson. I appreciate you sharing that. I remember reading sometime in the last year, somewhere around the turn of the century in Louisiana, there were less than 1,000 African Americans registered to vote. Now, this is 40 years after the Civil War. Less than 1,000 African Americans in the state of Louisiana registered to vote. That's history that we don't know. I'm ashamed to tell you, but it was last year when I was 67 years old that I first heard about the Tulsa massacre. No clue. And I'm somewhat educated, college, seminary, PhD, Christian ethics. I never heard about the Tulsa massacre until I was 67 years old. Skye, I look forward to hearing you because I know you're going to enlighten us from your perspective. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. And if you hear the cicadas in the back, it's a beautiful night in Washington. My name is Skye Perryman. For those who I haven't met that are able to join us tonight, I'm a lawyer, grew up in Texas, am active in the Baptist faith, went to Baylor University and practice law in Washington, DC. I'm pleased to be on the board of the Interfaith Alliance and on an advisory board for Good Faith Media. And so it's great to be here with all of you. And then in my day job, I am the president and CEO of Democracy Forward Foundation, which is a legal organization that brings cases to protect democracy as well as to propel social progress. We were founded in 2017 in response to an unprecedented amount of unlawful and unethical government activity in the wake of the 2016 election. And we are pivoting now to ensure that voices that need to be amplified in federal government are amplified and that abuses of power in the state legislatures across the country are challenged. And so I'm here in my personal capacity tonight, but that's a little bit of what I do in my day job. And I have just some brief comments, and we'll just point out that in 2 days, we will observe Women's Equality Day, which is a day that, to Mitch's comments, which is a day that where we celebrate the ability of some women to obtain the right to vote in the United States. And then over the weekend, we will have the 58th anniversary of the March on Washington. And I think that it's important that we're talking about this tonight because it really showcases, as we've known, that the fight is not over, that in many ways it is it's not only just beginning, but it's becoming more very difficult, perhaps even greater struggles than we've seen in the past. And it's pretty unbelievable to think about this in 2021, when you would think that we've moved beyond the struggles of the past, and we haven't. So I would just, as a person of faith, I think that voting, the ability of people to express their views, the ability of people to elect those who can represent them, the notion that that participation in civil society is for everyone, not just for a privileged few, is something that's fundamental. Mitch's comments were right on in terms of the Christian faith and what we know from Jesus Christ and his commitment to the marginalized, to those on the outskirts of society, and the fact that what we're seeing now in the states throughout the country is really an attack on the fundamental dignity of people. Anything that is seeking to make it more difficult for people to express their fundamental equality is an affront, not only to the principles of constitutional democracy in the United States, not only to the principles of constitutional democracy as recognized by the individual states and state constitutions, but also for people of faith and of creed. So thank you for having me tonight. I look forward to the discussion, for taking questions. And as we look to Women's Equality Day, as we look to the anniversary of the March on Washington, I think we have to remember that the march is not over, and we must move on together and see what we can do in these troubling times. So thank you all so much.
Thank you, Skye. We're thrilled to have you, and just proud of what you're doing. And you know, you're the future of the Interfaith Alliance. Jack and I, unfortunately, are getting on up there a little bit in the years. Although I can tell you, kids, you know, for Charlie and Jack and I to see the three of you, it's pretty encouraging. And it means a lot to us. Charlie, talk to us for a long time, friend.
David, we know your heart. It's so beautiful to be with you and our friends here and to have you speak so confessionally.
Charlie, let me interrupt a second. I just got a text. Breaking: Congress passes the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. Just passed,
Awesome.
People. Is that not cool? To get the text in the middle of this discussion. How about that?
That's so good, David. And it's just reflective, isn't it, of how the Holy Spirit is moving. Yeah, somebody said, Nancy said, God, it's great. Somebody said that on the text. I just saw it. It's an honor for me to be with all of you. I know of your work. I know your witness, your testimony, and it's strong and it's good. I'm going to try to take it from a little bit different angle from what Skye and Rabbi Jack and Reverend Mitch have already said, and we're going to hear from Reverend Starlette in just a moment, and Rose also. You know, it seems to me that there is a creative tension between the individual and the community at work, in our lives, in our nation. And we believe in both, don't we? We believe in the dignity of the individual. Rabbi Jack articulated that so beautifully. Reverend David did too at the beginning. Just every individual made in the image of God, that we have Godness within us. We're human, we're fallen, we're sinful. Look, I'm a Baptist preacher. I'm going to preach sin, okay? And it's an old story, and it's 100% recapitulated story, but there is this other goodness of God within us, and so we sort of move toward that goodness, that light. Try not to be too bifurcated in that. Try not to have a binary approach to to the interpretation of our existence in that way. But there is that struggle, isn't it? And so we need the community to hold us accountable. And we need, so there is that sort of, as I call it, a creative tension. We live between our impulses as the individual and our impulses as the community. So the one person, one vote reflects this mystery, it seems to me, that we all enter this sacred sanctuary, if you will, of the voting booth. This is one of our lines on our stump speech in Pastors for Texas Children, is that we close that curtain behind us, or we enter that little alcove, that confessional, if you will, and we make our confession before God. And we do that in our civic responsibility. David knows this. We've been involved in public theology and public life for a long, long time together as Baptists. And we've always affirmed that. Christian Life Commission, back during the true Baptist expression of it, affirmed that. Now the Texas Christian Life Commission affirms that. So we protect the right to vote. We've just invoked Congressman Lewis's name. Nobody stood for this pure American undistilled right any greater than Congressman Lewis. You know, Reverend Mitch said it. Look, from our outset, we have been struggling with this. Originally, people of African descent couldn't vote. Originally, women couldn't vote. Originally, only landowners could vote. And piecemeal by piecemeal, we peel back layer by layer, and now we believe in the universal right of God. We're moral people. We think this is a fundamental human right. We don't hear the term human rights much anymore, do we? We certainly don't hear it from Greg Abbott. We now have a governor that thinks he's a king. This is a problem, y'all. This is a problem in America. It's a problem in Texas. And David, I'm saying this as a minister of Christ's gospel. I'm saying this as executive director of Pastors for Texas Children. I'm not saying this in any kind of partisan way. We got plenty of Republicans that believe that Greg Abbott thinks God died and put him in charge. And so, of course, he wants to send down this edict from on high that we're going to keep people in Houston and Dallas and Fort Worth and San Antonio from voting. Well, it's malarkey. And it's going to require all of us to put our foot down like Texans and like Christians and say no to Caesar and no to this king. That we, yeah, thank you, Sally. We're speaking the truth. Look, I've quit preaching and gone to meddling, right? That we believe one person, one vote. And you get that plebiscite out there as available and accessible as possible. If Houstonians believe, and somebody needs to recognize the authority of local control, David. If the folks in Houston determine that 24-hour voting is the best way to make the that fundamental human right accessible to those Houstonians, you better believe it. And if mail-in voting is the best way to make that fundamental human right available to senior adults who are homebound, you better believe it. And if souls to the polls is the best way, and they finally negotiated that, right? Because the black folks stood up and said, no way, we're going to accept this. So it is a crisis in our democracy. The people in charge don't want democracy. They want an oligarchy, really. They want a monarchy is what we've got. And it's up to us. And look, we got 30 people on this call. We got plenty of people to say no to this king and yes to the power of the people.
Charlie, you've always been willing to tell it like it is. I used to always say that Foy Valentine, Christian Life Commission in Nashville, taught me to learn the difference in making noise and getting something done. And but you've always had a good knack for making noise but getting something done. And I always kind of say that to some of my progressive friends that don't think I'm progressive enough. Hey, you're making noise, but we got to make sure we get something done. But there's a time with what Greg Abbott's doing right now, in this complete lockdown on local control that is in trying to destroy local authority. I'm proud of National Independent School District today just released and said, if we get a COVID case in one school, that school becomes a mass school for everybody that walks in there. They just said, we don't care what you think, Greg Abbott. We're going to protect our kids.
That's right.
And we've got to protect the right to vote as well. So again, thank you. This panel is exactly what I expected it to be. Deeply committed people to their faith and to America. And that's the craziest thing I find going on right now is what the freak happened to the definition of a patriot. A patriot doesn't love this country blindly. It loves it and wants to improve it and cares about it. Doesn't try to take rights away from people. There's nothing more unpatriotic than trying to take away the right to vote. I mean, goodness sakes. Let me tell you a little short story in Starlette, then I'm waiting to hear you because you're going to be the best. I can just tell, watching that smile, you're going to be the best. But I have been to every single baseball stadium in America, 30 cities. I went to Cincinnati 3 years ago to get stadium number 28 before I got 29 in Tampa. And then 2 years ago, my whole family went with me to get stadium number 30 in St. Louis. Do y'all know the gym that is in Cincinnati, Ohio? The Museum of the Underground Railroad.
Mm.
An amazing place. The Museum of the Underground Railroad. I had no clue it was in Cincinnati, Ohio. I could have spent 3 days there. The history of what people did to save lives in this country is amazing. And it's worth a trip to Cincinnati, Ohio, which is a pretty neat little city anyway. So we've got to do the same thing with rights to vote. We have got to not be willing to allow this to happen across this country. And I'm trying to believe there's going to be a huge backlash to it. Starlette, it's your turn. Take off that mute button. Take that incredible smile and educate us about your faith and your commitment to this issue. Thanks for being here.
So glad to be with you. Mine will be a summary of sorts and an affirmation that we're all on one accord tonight. So I wrote down a few notes that begin this way. Voter suppression, hands down, is about theology for me, about who is made in the image of God and who can be recreated as colored, as something other than a human being. This is then used to justify the need for space, for land, for financial and material resources, for protection, for educational opportunities, for employment, for ownership, for justice, for fair representation, for healthcare and social services. Voter suppression is about visibility, about whose rights don't matter, sight unseen. It's about sexism, as women didn't get the right to vote until 1920. Sojourner Truth asked, ain't I a woman? Because no one is more of a human being than anyone else. It's about colonialism, as the First Nation people were not granted the right until 1924, though suppressed for decades. It's about an attempted genocide and having no plan for those who survived and secretly burying those who didn't after their heads were shaved, their tongues were tied, the culture reframed as hedonistic, and then the history denied with silly rhymes about Christopher Columbus. It is about who counts and who counts as fully human or 3/5 of a person and whose needs the American government has discounted historically. It is about the legacy of white supremacist terrorism, the Ku Klux Klan's night rides, and my ancestors who were strung high when poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses didn't turn them away from the polls. Because it's not a democracy if our leaders work to keep some people's hands down. Because some people hate to lose and will do anything to win. Hands down. Power over truth, victory over virtue, gain over the common good. Our leaders lie about stolen elections, stealing people, and stealing land. They're trying to fix the fight. This is why the votes must be counted, and faith leaders should be counted on to push back on the narrative that silences and suppresses, to stand with those whose backs are against the wall, as Howard Thurman describes it. Because according to my Christian faith tradition, God does not come in red, white, and blue. Is not an American citizen, but came as an out of this world immigrant who can be claimed by a nation, but not contained by one, who is not a cultural mascot, a race-based, handmade, hand-picked deity, who creates worlds, but does not revolve around our own, whose hands do not support our political machinery, which cranks out conspiracy theories and crushes poor souls impoverished and marginalized for the sake of our capitalistic gain, whose will is not rooted in white supremacist ideology, who would prefer we keep the church and the state separate, who is not with you and against me, who had both hands in creating everybody, not to compete or to compare, but to commune, who is the best example of community, hands down.
Amen.
Knew you were going to steal the show, Starlette. Well, that's extremely thoughtful, and it's extremely timely, and the perspective of it is just very, very healthy. Guys, I want you all to unmute. Guys, Starlette and Skye, remember, 68-year-old man from Texas just said, guys, you just got to live with that sometimes.
There's lots of grace over here. There's lots of grace.
Yeah, I thought lots of grace. I needed a whole hell of a lot of grace my whole life, to tell you the truth. And Charlie and Jack, Mitch, all three of them know about that. But anyway, talk to each other. If you were, you've kind of done it, but Texas tomorrow is going to vote on this horrendous bill on voter suppression. In 1 minute, tell me what you would say if you were testifying in front of the Texas House tomorrow. Go, Charlie.
Well, David, I've been on these weekly calls with these House Democrats, so you probably have too. And it's look, we need to be extending voting rights to more and more Texans. We've got emerging generations. We've got newly empowered people coming into the electorate. This is what any party that's comfortable with their message does, right? But the party in power is not comfortable with their message. They know that their message is un-American, it's un-Christian, it's un-Texan. They know that. And it's what the person you quoted, whose name I've tried to forget for 30 years, said a long time ago, 3 decades ago. We don't want people voting. Because if they vote, they will not endorse and affirm our message of consolidated power and influence rather than distributed power and influence. Look, democracy isn't perfect. There's nothing perfect about it. Was it Churchill that said democracy is the worst form of government? With that sort of pregnant pause, I guess there's another phrase that dates me as a white male, old. And then he said, except for all the rest. And that's exactly right. Democracy is messy. It's inherently corrupt. Inherently corrupt. Because you got all these sinful people. Rabbi Jack alluded to this in his opening message. You got all these sinful people weighing in. My vote's not perfect. But when my vote is counted with Jack's and with Skye's and with Starlette's and Mitch's and David's and the other esteemed participants in this call, then roughly vox populi, vox Dei. What else do we have, y'all? What else do we have than that? I'm going to take my chances with vox populi, the voice of the people, the voice of God. Is it always the case? Well, goodness, no. Reverend Starlette already said that. We have the majority of people in this country, disenfranchising Black folks up until a short time ago. But it's messy, it's corrupt, it's sinful, but it's the best we have. Let's trust it. Let's extend. So that's the speech I'd give before the Senate's already bought off.
Oh yeah,
basically 2/3 of the Senate, and every time the Dan Patrick just changes the rules at will, right? Used to be you had to have 3/4 of you had to have 3/4 of an affirmation to bring a bill to the floor, and now he's changed it, and he's going to keep changing it until he gets what he wants. Yeah. You don't have even House members. You've got, let me just say this, and I'll cede the floor, David. You now have so many powerful, rich forces nationally buying off these Senate and House members that they don't have to listen to the people of Texas. And that's the problem we have right now. That's the problem. As long as Charles Koch just keeps funding, it's only 150 House members. It's only 31 Senate members. So, all they've got is a constituency of a few. They don't have to listen to their districts. As long as you have enough money to buy social media and buy billboards and buy television ads. And that's, That's what we have. I'm saying that the Democratic vision, lowercase d, is to get underneath all that. Look, I'm just going to say how the cow ate the cabbage. We got to get Black folks registered to vote and voting. We got to get brown folks registered to vote and voting. And we got to get poor white folks registered to vote and voting. And people in Tom Green County and Tarrant County and every county in between. And when we do that, and when we go into all those communities and say, really, is building a wall on the on the Rio Grande River really in your best interest, or is having a hospital that works in your best interest? That's when we're going to have a different, more moral politics in this state.
Well, thank you, Charlie. You're always passionate. I say to folks, talk about public education, talk about healthcare, talk about jobs, talk about Jesus, and shut up.
That's
no
about
offense
right.
to you, Jack. No offense to you, Jack. But I think that's the way you win elections. And again, you got to focus on knowing the difference and making noise and getting something done. There's nothing more critical to that than to be effective. And I hear these folks that want to have these long, nuanced discussions about things, and it just comes down to education, healthcare, jobs, and Jesus, or faith, or whatever. Now, Jack, I'm going to go to you right now. Since you've been on my ranch and you love my goats, you can respond to me if I offended you. But we've been friends for so long, I don't think we can offend each other. But I'm giving it to you now.
And I'll be briefer because I don't have to talk about Jesus. If I had 1 minute to talk to your legislators, I wouldn't even need it. I would say, look, it's my experience in all my years that the law can serve as a shield or a sword. And if it's being used as a sword, it's only because the people who are promoting that approach don't have the confidence that they're right in enough measure to persuade the voters and their constituency of what to do. So if that's how you want to be known, as someone who doesn't have the confidence in his own convictions, then go ahead with this.
Starlette, go.
Oh, and Jesus.
Thank you, Jack. I told him on the Interfaith Alliance board one time, I ain't compromising. I'm on this board to tell y'all to believe in Jesus. Now I'm a little bit more progressive than that, to be quite honest with you, but I got to stick with who I am a little bit. But I will tell you this: Jack Moline invited me to his home, my wife Loretta and I, for that Friday night meal. What do you call that, Jack?
Shabbat dinner.
Okay, I'm not going to try to repeat that. One of the most spiritual experiences, top 2 or 3 in my life, was to be in his home on Friday night. And then he let me speak to a synagogue. Now, how's that for risk? A Texas rancher speaking to a synagogue in Northern Virginia. That's pretty brave. Starlette, go.
I'm going to go with the rabbi. There's a generation coming that does not want your hand-me-down hatreds. Keep doing what you're doing. Keep pulling your levers and thinking that you're pulling strings. There are people coming after you for which they will have no interest in these conceited efforts. So go along. Do what you must do, but it will be done sooner rather than later.
Okay, your turn, Skye.
I would focus on the fact that there are some things that are beyond politics and that are fundamental to our country, to who we are as individuals and people with dignity, and that voting, the ability to have your say count just as everyone else's, is one of those. And so regardless of who comprises in any legislative body or any court or any executive branch, there are some things that should be beyond that, and voting is one of them.
I love the words you use, Skye. Dignity. I don't think that's a word we use as much as we ought to anymore. Go ahead.
Well, when you deprive people of the ability to vote, when you make it harder, when you try to humiliate people, make it to where people have to make multiple trips, stand in line, be late for work, be embarrassed in front of their kids. I mean, that's what's happening with voter suppression efforts. These are real people. You're humiliating them, making it impossible for people to be able to have that. And in doing that, you're undermining people's dignity as individuals, not as any particular political party, but as individuals who, we believe in our faith traditions are all created equally in the image of the divine. And of course, we believe in our constitutional tradition, are all worthy of the ability to have life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness.
Okay, of everything I heard tonight, then I'm going to text my state rep after this shuts down. It's what you just said, Skye. That's really good stuff. Thank you. Go, Mitch.
The vote is tomorrow. Is that correct?
To my understanding, SB 1 will be voted on tomorrow in the Texas House, which is our voter suppression law. I mean, they
What
call
I
it the
would
voter whatever law, but it's the voter suppression law.
What I would say to Texas legislators tomorrow would be this. If you cast your vote to advance this bill, then you are letting Governor Wallace and Bull Connor, and what I mean by that is Governor Abbott and his cronies, take us back to the Edmund Pettit Bridge. This is not who you are. This is not who we are as Americans. This is not democracy. This is not who the Republican Party is. This isn't the party of Lincoln. Where did that party go? When we put barriers before citizens to cast their right to vote, then we are simply dehumanizing them, making them prove their existence. As a Native American, as a Muskogee Creek, I know what it's like to have a roll number, to prove to people I am who I am. Starlette knows from her ancestors what it's like to walk down and have to hand a white man paper. Other traditions know what it's like to prove that you are who you are. And in a democracy, a vote is an individual's right to exist. And when we thwart that, when we pass pieces of legislation that put barriers between the individual and the right to exist, we are not only guilty of being undemocratic, but we are guilty of being unchristian. And it is a evil, evil thing to do. So I would beg Texas legislators, do not vote for this piece of legislation, because you know down deep inside, this is not who you are. Stand up to the money, stand up to the powerful, and make certain you're on the right side of history, because I know what side that is. I've read a textbook.
Wow.
Mitch, that's so powerful. The only reason we're having this bill, let's be very clear, is because of one person who now lives in South Florida, who has told the world that the election was fraudulent, that it was fake, that it was corrupt. Republican legislators, judges, and courts all over the country, friends, said, okay, let's count the votes again. Let's count them a second time. Let's count them a third time. Let's do it again. They found no voter fraud that would have any substantive outcome on the election. The jury is in, sisters and brothers. There is no voter fraud in this country. And yet, Greg Abbott, Dan Patrick, Ken Paxton, let that sink in. Our chief law enforcement officer in Texas is under indictment. Have said to the Texas people, we have a voter fraud problem. Legislature, you have to do something about it. So the whole thing is fabricated, trumped up, if you will. And that is the reason we have this bill in the first place. So this is what I would tell decent rural Republican people, David, like Drew Darby, who is our dear friend. But here's the problem. The problem is that Drew will not be reelected unless he votes for this bill. And for Price up in Amarillo, I mean, I shouldn't name names. And Glenn Rogers out in Mineral Wells. And I could go on with all these great, decent, pro-public education, rural Republicans. And the reason for that is because Charles Koch and the Heritage Foundation and the Cato Institute and a lot of other right-wing money, the Wilkes brothers out of Cisco, and the oil guy out of Dallas have so pumped so much money into these elections that they cannot get reelected unless they vote the way about this many people tell them to. And y'all, I'm gonna say it again, the only way to fire these people is to go get every kid in East Fort Worth and South Dallas who's 18 years old, registered to vote, empowered, affirmed, educated, trained, and activated to go vote. That's hard work. That's hard work. It's hard work for a rabbi, it's hard work for a pastor, it's hard work for an activist. But that is the only way that we're going to flip and turn this situation. That's what we've got to do.
You know, Charlie, within the last week, my wife and I watched Charlie Wilson's War, Tom Hanks. And he's telling a story to Amy Adams, who I just love as an actress. And he's telling her how he got in politics. And the city councilman killed his dog. And I don't know how many of y'all have seen this. This is a 1997 or so movie. And Tom Hanks tells her, you know what I did? I went across the tracks in East Texas, over in the African-American community. And there were 400 votes in that election. And I drove 96 of those votes to the polls that day. And that city councilman lost by 16 votes. And then he said a great line. He said, that's when I knew I loved America. I think that's a pretty good story to end with, folks. That's what we've got to do if we want to save this country, is drive those folks, find those folks, get them to the polls. We're not going to stop what's going to happen in Austin tomorrow. We're going to need Skye Perryman and good lawyers to help stop how bad what's going to happen in Austin over the next 2 weeks, Skye. We're counting on you to help stop that, because you've got skills that Jack and Mitch and Charlie and Starlette and I don't have. You got some legal skills. Involve my son in Dallas, Lance. He's awful good at that too. But we can do the other. We can find those 96 people to drive to the polls and beat that damn city council member that killed his dog. And that's what makes America great.
Hey, Dave.
Y'all, this is a lot of fun. And then you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to challenge the 5 of you to join me, and let's do this once a month for the next year or so, because we can talk about a ton of stuff.
David, don't forget Rose.
Don't forget Rose.
I won't forget Rose, but she's tied to the party, so she may be a Rose. Do you want to say something before we quit, young lady? Because you're new to the party, right?
I've been here about 1.5 years, so relatively new.
Relatively new. Well, with COVID, I hadn't got to have a meeting to meet you, so good to have you here. Talk to us a second.
Well, I really just appreciated hearing everything that y'all had to say. And I quite frankly wish that I had this 2 days ago, because I did testify in front of the committee yesterday and could have used some of your inspiration in my remarks. So appreciate this very much. And while, you know, David and Charles are not wrong that there is a lot of writing on the wall of the situation, we do still need to fight and tell our legislators that we oppose this legislation and that people are watching, right? Because they can't think that the only people that are watching and they're paying attention are the Koch brothers and are the, you know, the people that are funding them. They have to know that the citizens in their communities do oppose this law and want them to fight back against it and, you know, want the right to vote. So please take the time tomorrow to call your state representative and tell them that you oppose Senate Bill 1 and that you want them to fight back against it, because as we saw in the chat, there is an election judge saying, I'm not going to serve as an election worker in my community anymore if we pass this law, because it's going to be too hard because I'm going to be threatened by this. And that's what I've heard over and over again. So please call your representative and oppose this. You can find their information at TXDEM, that's TXDEM.co/myrep. That's TXDEM.co/myrep. And then you can find your representative and give them a call. Thank you all so much.
Thank y'all. Great fun. Kind of, some of us that have been doing this a long time needed a little energy injection, and y'all gave it to us. Thank you very, very much. Love you all. Thank you.
Thanks. David.
Adios, y'all. God bless.